We have Tyrus. We have Michael. And as of right now, that's it. Doesn't look like I missed anybody. Oh, and it's 8 o'clock. Good timing. We are recording. We'll get started. We're going to do things as we normally would. Actually, 1 second. I see that there's 3 new emails. Let me make sure that that's not somebody who showed up. And it is not. Okay. So anyway, yeah, we're going to do things as we normally would. So the first word for attendance is going to be printer, like something you would, print something off of, a printer. Now I'm going to share my screen. I'm still dealing with technology issues on top of all this. So I don't have my work computer, which means I'm using my personal computer, which means I don't have Microsoft Office and I don't have PowerPoint. So the PowerPoint's gonna look a little bit different because I'm scrolling through it through Google Classroom. But anyway, here's where we left off. We finished talking about that first bullet point, which is an overview of population ecology. To jog your memory, the last thing we talked about was this. We were talking about the difference between equilibrial life history versus opportunistic life history. And we were talking about how that is kind of related to the idea of a type 1, type 2, or type 3 population growth. Now we're going to talk about population growth models. And remember, when we're talking about population ecology, basically that's what we're studying, right? We're studying the fluctuation of a population size and the things that cause that fluctuation. So to do that, obviously one of the important tools we're going to use is a population growth model, and you'll see why. Obviously, as you might imagine, well, you definitely know, I would assume, the population sizes fluctuate, right? No population of any species, I would assume for the most part, is non-changing, right? It changes. So what makes it change? What makes it go up or down? As you might know already, I would assume you do know this, that as individuals come into a population, it increases. And as individuals leave a population, it decreases, right? It's very simple. So what are the 2 ways that individuals can come into a population? Well, they're either going to be born there or they're going to move into that area. Likewise, how are individuals going to leave a population? They're either going to die or they're going to move out. Very simple concept, but make sure you know that. That's how population size fluctuate, right? You get individuals coming in or you get individuals coming out. And it's either through death or immigration or birth. Are there any questions about that? And remember, if you do have a question, you have to hit that raise your hand button so I can hear it ding, and then I can come back to the other screen and look. All right, so these models that we're going to talk about, those investigate how the sizes of the population can change over time under different conditions. Because again, try to remember back what we talked about on Wednesday when I was trying to discuss why this might be relevant. This isn't strictly an academic discussion, right? If you are involved in criminal justice, then you're going to be interested in population change. If you're involved in business, you're going to be interested in the size of population change. Department of Defense, right? All these reasons, there's so many reasons why you would be concerned about the change of the size of the population. And that's just the human population. And I also gave examples again on Wednesday about, DNR. So you'd be concerned with the size of the deer population or the trout population or whatever it may be. But anyway, let's jump into it. The first one we're going to talk about is the exponential population growth model. And before I get into these different growth models, I'll go ahead and tell you, you're going to need to know the difference between these two that we're about to discuss. And for the exam, most likely, I'll just give you an example. I'm going to paint a picture, right? I'll describe a scenario. And then when I describe that scenario, you need to recognize it as either an exponential population growth model or a logistic population growth model. So here we go. Let's talk about the first one. Exponential population growth. That is an expansion, obviously an expansion in the population, in an ideal and unlimited environment. So that's what causes it. More specifically, what it is, it's when the population size of each new generation is calculated by multiplying the current population by a constant factor that represents birth rate minus death rate. And you don't necessarily need to memorize that definition. You could almost think of it as All right, look at the human population. Assume that the human population, I don't know, doubled every generation. So every generation, two people get together and they have four kids. That's not the case depending on where you are on Earth, but for the purposes of this example, let's use that. So that would mean the constant factor would be two. So if the population was 2 billion, and it's not, it's way above that. If the population was 2 billion right now, that means then in the next generation, it would be 4 billion, right? Because the constant factor is two. Because we're in this hypothetical scenario, we're saying that every generation humans have have two children. So then you multiply that. So the next generation, you would have 8 billion, right? Because 4 times 2 is 8. And then the generation after that, you would have 16 billion. And then the generation after that will be 32, 64, so on and so forth. And you can see what I mean by now why we call it exponential, because it might start slow, it might start small, but it exponentially grows. Think of bacteria for an example. And again, actually, bacteria is a great example. Imagine you just had this one lonely bacteria that you coughed out of your nasty mouth, and it landed somewhere on your kitchen counter. And there's plenty of nutrients that you can't see on your kitchen counter, and it's just that one bacteria. But then it goes through mitosis, and then you have two. And then each one of those goes through mitosis, and then it's 4, and then again 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256. That's exponential growth, right? It just doubles and doubles and doubles in that scenario. But again, in the scenario I'm discussing, constant factor, I'm just using the word 2, or the number 2. It could be any constant factor, but again, you can see hopefully what I mean by exponential growth. Are there any questions about that? All right. And the reason that happens is because, again, like we said up here, this is an ideal and unlimited environment. I mean, technically nothing is unlimited, but for academic purposes, we're calling it unlimited. So, practically, again, a bacteria falling on, I don't know, even better. What if you have a bacteria that falls on the dirt in your backyard? As far as that bacteria is concerned, that's essentially an unlimited environment. I mean, we know technically it's not, but for all intents and purposes, it is. So, how can you recognize exponential population growth, other than the fact that the population is, expanding the way I just described it? Well, this accelerating growth produces a J-shaped curve. That's something you should memorize for two reasons. One, there might be a question. I doubt it, but there might be a question where I actually do say, which population growth model produces a J-shaped curve. I doubt I'm going to be that simple with it, but if I do, you need to know it. Plus, there is a question about that on the study guide. Now, you might be wondering what I mean by J-shaped curve. If you are wondering, that's okay. Just hold off. I'll show you a picture here in a second. And the fact that we have a J-shaped curve, try to picture it in your mind. And again, I'll show you in a second, like a J-shaped. That steep slope, that shows how rapidly a population is growing. Because imagine, I know this is hard to see, but imagine, that's a steep slope versus just a really slow slope, right? Or a really low slope. If it was really low, that wouldn't be exponential population growth, and that would not be a rapidly growing population. Anyway, where is this common? Where do we normally see exponential population growth? That would be in certain situations. Obviously, when we're talking about bacteria, that could be anywhere, essentially, or almost anywhere, because for them, it is almost an unlimited environment anywhere. But if you're talking about other populations, maybe humans or, I don't know, certain trees or mammals, reptiles, whatever, you will usually see this following a disturbance. And I'll talk about what a disturbance is a little bit more later. But for now, just think of a disturbance as something, well, it's in the word, right? It disturbs the environment. So some examples of disturbances might be a fire, a flood, a hurricane, a drought, a cold snap. A fire is a good example. So if you had this really thick forest, this really like an acre of really thick forest, and there was hardly any sun reaching the floor of the forest because, you had these really big old trees. Well, if you had a really bad fire and just everything burned to the ground, then all of a sudden you have no competition, right? You have no other plants absorbing the water. You have no other plants blocking out the light. You have nothing but this big open expanse of really rich, fertile soil from, the other trees that burned down. So that would be an ideal unlimited environment for another plant. So assume some seed lands in that area, it's going to grow, right? That population is going to grow exponentially because there's nothing holding it back. Are there any questions so far? All right, here's a picture. That's what I mean by the J-shaped curve. And rabbits are a great example because they're really good at reproducing. But anyway, this is just an example. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you a question about rabbits specifically. But again, for the exam, I'm probably going to describe a scenario, and you're going to have to recognize it as a exponential growth model. And some of the things I might describe the graph. Like I said, probably not. But I'll probably say something like this. Again, I'm painting a picture with my words in the exam. So I'll probably say something like there was a drought, or there was a hurricane, or there was a mudslide, or there was a nuclear explosion. Maybe not that, because then you'd have radioactive soil. But anyway, the point is I'll probably describe a disturbance, and then I'll probably describe the population growing unlimited, and that would be an exponential growth model. Any questions so far? I'm just looking to see who's here. Same people. Looks like we're missing some people. That's all right. Actually, 1 second. I need to check one more thing. While I'm checking this, I'll go ahead and give you another word for attendance. And that word is football. Like the sport, the college sport that is played in the fall. I mean, I guess it's also played professionally, but who cares, right? I'm all about college football. Anyway, let's get back to it. So that's it about exponential population growth model. The next one we're going to talk about is the other situation, which is logistic population growth model. And again, for the exam, you're going to need to know the difference between the two. And I'm going to probably give you a scenario or two scenarios, and you're going to have to figure out which is which. As I said earlier, most environments are not unlimited, especially if we're talking about anything other than something as simple as, a bacteria. If you're talking about a larger population, like humans are great examples, or the squirrels that live on WVSU's campus, or the maple trees that live in South Charleston, whatever it may be, these are not unlimited environments. There are something called limiting factors, and you need to know what a limiting factor is. And it's funny because this kind of goes back to evolution, even though your book doesn't talk about it right now. It's those limiting factors that cause that unequal reproductive success in evolution, because limiting factors are environmental factors that restrict population growth, and they control the number of individuals that can occupy a habitat. So again, thinking about the squirrels on WVSU's campus, what do they need? They need water, they need food, they need shelter, right? At least those three things. And that is not an unlimited environment. There's only X amount of oak trees, for example, giving them acorns to eat. There's only X amount of trees where they can hide. So those are what limiting factors are. And here's some new words you need to know. Carrying capacity, that is the maximum size that a particular environment can sustain. And that's a very, very important concept a little bit later in the semester. Of course, we only have a couple weeks left, but we're going to talk about human population growth eventually. And when we do, we're going to talk about carrying capacity. But yeah, you need to know that carrying capacity is the maximum size that a particular environment can sustain. What do I mean by that? I'm going to give an example. These are not the actual numbers because I don't know. But again, using the same example, let's assume that WVSU's campus the maximum number of squirrels in it can sustain is 100 squirrels, right? That would be carrying capacity. Now, mind you, think about it. WVSU's campus, if you tried to fit as many squirrels as you could on the campus, like if somehow you could fence it off and squeeze them in there and make sure they couldn't escape, obviously we could fit more than 100 squirrels on our campus. But could we sustain them, right? Again, they have to have places to eat. They need water. They have to have places to hide from the predators. They need places to go give birth to their young and protect their young, things like that. So yes, make sure you know what carrying capacity is. The next term you need to understand is something called logistic growth. And that is what we're talking about. That's what we originally started talking about to begin with, right? The logistic growth model. The logistic growth is when the growth rate decreases as the population size approaches carrying capacity. So in a sense, I think the best way to think about this, and I don't think your book describes it this way, to me, this is like a sequel to exponential growth, right? Because in exponential growth, the population is exploding because things are unlimited, or at least academically we'll say they're unlimited, right? So what happens in a real life scenario is, again, using the example that we had earlier from this slide from your textbook, if there's a disturbance like a fire or a drought or whatever it may be, if there's a disturbance, then there's a relatively unlimited environment. So therefore a population is going to explode. You're going to have that J-shaped curve, but then you're eventually going to reach that carrying capacity. You're going to hit that point where the environment can no longer sustain any more increase in the population, and that would be logistic growth. Oh yeah, and another thing, really quick. What happens when the population size approaches carrying capacity? The population at carrying capacity is zero, or excuse me, the population growth rate is zero. So again, the population essentially quits growing. And here's what I mean by that. And this is a real life example. These are breeding males, breeding male fur seals. I forgot what island it was on, but it was a study they did somewhere. I think it was off the coast of Alaska. And you can think about that. This is back in the, you can see the dates here. This is back in the day. So we didn't have as much overfishing as we do now. So in this case, the limiting factor was the fact that they were on this little rocky island. They just literally had nowhere else to live. So the highest number that they could fit was about, let's see, what's that? I don't know, close to 10,000, right? Over 9,000, close to 10,000. That would be carrying capacity. And you might get a picture like this on the exam, and I might say, what is the carrying capacity of this population? And you could look at it, and you would have to estimate, oh yeah, right about 9,000. And obviously it's a multiple choice exam. So anything close to, higher 9,000, close to 10,000 would be the correct answer. Another thing I want to point out is this is a growth model, just like the last one we talked about, the exponential growth model. The point here is that nothing always fits a model perfectly because this line represents the model, but these dots represent actual data, right? So they took the population numbers here, and then this year, and this year, and you can see it actually fluctuates. It's not perfectly on the line, and you can see sometimes the population number is actually above carrying capacity, but eventually it drops back down. And if this were to be extended farther to the right, you would probably see ups and downs for the most part in perpetual, just keep going because it wouldn't be perfectly on that line. But that's, again, a hypothetical line right there. That is the hypothetical carrying capacity. So are there any questions about the relationship between exponential growth and logistic growth? All right. And again, I want to remind you for the exam, I'm probably going to just describe those two scenarios and you'll tell me which is which. And again, keep in the back of your mind, this will be an important concept a little bit later in the semester when we discuss human population growth, because we are not at carrying capacity. But that is something that we will need to keep in the back of our mind. Like what happens when humans do hit carrying capacity? Because it isn't just going to be like humans say, oh, there's that hypothetical number. We should stop increasing our population, right? That's not going to happen. Just like in nature, that doesn't happen. It's not like these seals decided, oh, well, that's our highest number. We should slow down our reproduction. No, what happens is they keep reproducing the same amount if they can, but there's just more death, right? There's more death rates. The birth rate goes down, not because they choose to it, right? These seals, that guy right there is not saying, I'm going to have fewer kids. No, nature is imposing that in deadly ways. But anyway, we'll come back to that concept. The next slide I'm going to show you compares logistic growth with exponential growth. And again, like I said earlier, both of these are theoretical ideals of population growth, and no natural population fits either perfectly, which again goes back to that idea where I was showing you the dots versus the red line, right? It's just a model. It's theoretical. So here we go. There's logistic growth that we already talked about with those seals, and then we had exponential growth that we talked about with the rabbits. And again, if we could extrapolate, I would say that this right here for these rabbits, eventually, if you kept going, eventually you would hit carrying capacity because, like I said earlier, there is no truly unlimited environment. Now, there might be an environment that is so bountiful that it would not be realistic to think a population would ever hit the carrying capacity. But in all actuality, there is no unlimited environment. The Earth itself is a limited environment, right? Anyway, are there any questions so far? All right, let's move forward. So since we're talking about all these things, these limiting factors, that kind of dictate the growth and the shrinking of a population, let's talk about some different types of factors: density dependent, density independent. And then after that, we'll talk about population cycles. Now, for the exam, um, I'll probably give you some examples. I'll give you some examples of some limiting factors, and you'll have to determine whether they are density dependent factors or density independent factors. And before we jump into it, I'm hoping this is a really easy concept. If I could hear you, I would ask you some questions and see if you guys could come up with some ideas that I bet you could. When we say density dependent, what we mean is population density. Like, is it dependent on the population density or is it not? It's that simple. So here we go. Density dependent factors. Again, everything we're talking about is limiting factors, but these are specifically limiting factors whose intensity is related to the population density. Pretty simple, right? It's in the name. It's a limiting factor, and it's all dictated by the population density. Your book points out, I don't know why I included this, I really didn't need to, that it can limit the growth in natural populations. Obviously, everything we're talking about, density dependent or density independent, they're all limiting factors. Therefore, they can both limit growth in natural populations. But your book points out an obvious example, and you need to know this word: intra-specific competition, which is competition between the same species for limited resources. So I'll give you a second to take notes if you are. And I think the easy way to remember that is that intra, in this context, is the opposite of inter. Like an interstate is a road that brings you between different states, right? The internet brings you different places, so to speak, digitally. Intra is within the same, right? So if it was inter-specific competition, it would be competition between different species. And if it was intra-specific, which is the book example, that is competition between the same species. And it's interesting to me that your book points this out and doesn't specifically discuss inter-specific competition until later, because that almost infers that inter-specific competition is not a density dependent factor, but it is too. Speaking of which, I don't want you to memorize all the different density dependent factors. What I want you to do is to be able to use that brain of yours. And if I were to describe something to you that you've never heard of before, I want you to be able to recognize that as dependent or independent. For example, this textbook was written before COVID-19. COVID-19 is a density dependent factor, right? Because you could think of, if you had like five, if you were to look at Alaska and you had, I don't know, 2 people for every 100 square miles and they hardly ever see each other, they're not going to pass along that disease. They're not going to pass along a communicable disease because they hardly ever see anybody. Meanwhile, a place like New York, where you have a really high population density, it's going to be easily passed. You get one sick person on a subway, then all of a sudden you have a bunch of sick people on that subway, and then they are going to go and get into a crowded elevator. And then all those people are potentially going to be sick, right? So I'm hoping you can see what I mean by density dependent, right? The higher that population density is, the more likely it is that this thing is going to kill more people, or excuse me, kill more individuals of the population. Your book also points out density dependent factors can lower birth rate and increase death rate. And then, in hindsight, I wish I would have taken that out of the slide as well, because this can also be said for density independent factors, right? Because either way, what we're talking about is limiting factors, and any limiting factor can lower the birth rate and increase the death rate. Your book does give some more examples other than intra-specific competition. Accumulation of toxic waste products. We don't think about that often because, for the most part, humans kind of take care of that for the most part. Now, that's a whole different discussion if we're talking about the health of the environment. But think about, I don't know, a good example might be a petri dish with bacteria on it. They produce things, right? We all do. Humans, we produce, urine, we produce feces, we produce carbon dioxide, right, when we do go through cellular respiration. And in theory, if you were to put humans, a bunch of humans in a sealed off room, other than the fact that they would die of a lack of oxygen eventually, you could also die from that toxic waste product of carbon dioxide. That would eventually be toxic. So that's a good example. And again, if you just had a 10 by 10 room that was sealed off to the rest of the world, the more people you have in there, the quicker people are going to die, right? Because it's density dependent. Because when I say the more people you have in that room, that is more people per square foot, right? That is population density. Disease transmission under crowded conditions. Again, COVID-19 is a great example of that. If it's a communicable disease, obviously the more people you have closer together, the quicker it's going to be transmitted. Limited food. That's a more natural example. By natural, I mean that's one that you see more when you get away from the human population and talk about the squirrels on WVSU's campus, for example. So what's going to happen if there's a higher population? There's something happens and a bunch of squirrels are born on campus. Well, there's not going to be more food. So probably what's going to happen is some of those squirrels are either starve to death, or more likely they're going to leave and go somewhere else, right? In which case that would, either way, that's going to lower the population because they're either dead or gone. But either way, again, the population is lowered. Same can be said for water. Obviously some places water is more scarce than others. And of course, limited shelter. And these are all things I mentioned with the whole metaphor, the example of the squirrels on WVSU's campus, right? They need a place to eat. They need food to eat. They need water to drink. They need a place to hide from predators. They need places to raise their babies, things like that. And again, using WVSU's campus as an example, if you have 100 squirrels per campus, that might be enough hiding spots. But then if you get up to 150 squirrels per campus, then you're going to have 50 squirrels without hiding spots. And those are going to be the ones most likely to get, run over by a car or eaten by a stray cat, something like that. In which case, again, the population growth rate goes back down to zero and, nature kind of maintains that carrying capacity. Here's some examples from your book. I'd go into this, but we're a little bit behind on time. Just you read it. Yeah, read the graphs. If you have any questions, let me know. This just shows that as the density of females increases, you can see that the mean number of offspring also decreases. Excuse me. Density of females increase, and basically how many offspring they have also or decreases. So those are inverse relationships. Meanwhile, here, as the density increases, then the death rate increases. So all these things all we're saying here is that as the population density increases, then you have these density dependent factors, which will either lower the birth rate, as you see on the left, or increase the death rate, as you can see on the right. So any questions about that? All right, now on to the next one. And again, this is essentially the opposite. Now we're not talking about density dependent, we're talking about density independent. I'm just looking to see who's still here. Okay. Moving forward, let's talk about this. Density independent factors. So we're still talking about limiting factors. These are still things that are going to lower the population growth rate by either increasing death rate or decreasing birth rate. But in this case, the intensity of which is unrelated to the density, right? So it doesn't matter if you have 100 squirrels on our campus, or if you have 1,000 squirrels on our campus, or if you have one squirrel on our campus. Either way, it doesn't matter. So some examples are changes in weather or climate, right? So the squirrels living on our campus are used to the weather and climate that we have right now. Now let's assume, I don't know what happens, that maybe, I don't know, a meteor hits somewhere on Earth and it puts ash and dust and debris into the atmosphere, and for 100 years we're into a miniature ice age, right? In which case it would be too cold for the squirrels on our campus to survive. So 100% of the squirrels would die. Whether that 100% is one squirrel or 10 squirrels or 1,000 squirrels or 1,000,000 squirrels per campus, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how densely they are packed in. The fact is that 100% are going to die. And again, your book gives them some other examples, like a fire, floods, storms. A nuclear bomb in that case would be a density independent factor because it's going to kill, X amount of people. Let's say it kills 100% of the people within a 1 mile blast radius. Well, that's 100% of the people, regardless if it's 1,000,000 people in that 1 square mile, or if it's 5 people in that 1 square mile. Either way, the nuclear bomb doesn't care. It's going to, wouldn't care about anything anyway, because it's not a real object, not a living object, but you get what I'm saying. So are there any questions about a density independent factor? Your book gives an example. Um, this shows the number of aphids, which are these little insects. They're kind of like a crop pest. So they have an exponential growth rate, as most insects do. And then all of a sudden, because the weather changes, it gets too hot, or and I don't remember your book example, or but it could be that because this is a crop pest, perhaps the crop is harvested and now there's no longer anything to eat, so all of a sudden it dies. Right, almost 100% of that population is dead. Doesn't matter how many aphids there are per, I don't know, square meter. Doesn't matter. The fact is something happened right here in mid-June that's killing nearly 100% of the population. So, any questions about this? All right. All this being said, and again, remember, for the exam, you need to recognize the differences between density dependent and density independent, because I'm going to give you an example of one or both, and you need to decide which is which. Or, and let me tell you this, because I sort of want to be tricky, but at least I want to give you a heads up. I might give you two examples of a density dependent. And in your brain, you might think, well, if the other one was dependent, this one must be independent. Right? Don't think that, right? You might have two dependent examples, you might have two independent examples. So just keep that in the back of your mind. The idea here is for you to recognize a scenario as dependent or independent. But anyway, that being said, your book points out that in the long term, populations are regulated by a complex interaction of density dependent and independent factors, right? So it's not just one or the other. Just like the population growth models weren't specifically on that red line, right? Those are all theoretical. Same with this. It's a good combination of dependent versus and independent factors. Any questions so far? And check the chat function, make sure nobody's said anything. Okay, good. Let's keep moving forward. Actually, since we're doing this, the next word for attendance, this will be new. I'm going to change this up. I'm not going to say it. I'm going to type it. That is the next word for attendance. I typed it right there. Anyway, let's move forward. So we're done talking about dependent factors and independent factors and how they're different from each other, and we mentioned how they both affect population at the same time. So now we have that out of the way. Let's talk about population cycles. This is a very simple concept. And what I mean by population cycles is sort of like I showed you earlier. It's not, you might have exponential growth at first, but then you'll balance out and you'll have logistic growth. But then we have something called boom and bust cycles, which kind of are what they sound like. The population booms, like it goes up really quick, and then it busts, meaning it drops really quick. Your book is a very specific example of the snowshoe hare and its main predator, the lynx, which is a type of predatory cat. I'm going to show you some graphs a little bit later. But keep in mind, this is just an example. There are questions about this on the study guide, but I'm probably not going to specifically ask you questions about the hare and the lynx on the exam. Anyway, boom and bust cycles may be caused by this particular example of the hares and the lynx. The boom and bust cycles may be caused by food shortages in the winter because the snowshoe overgrazed. It also can be caused by predator prey interactions. And of course, more likely it's caused by a combination of the two. And we don't know for sure, but keep in mind, this is not a hypothetical example. This is actually numbers that scientists have been keeping since before 1850, right? So they've kept track of these numbers. Snowshoe hare is in the blue, the lynx is in the red. And you can understand how this might be related. So let's look at this blue line to start with. The hare population just explodes, right? And as it explodes, you can see slowly, eventually, the lynx population does too, because, oh man, it's got so much to eat. Then probably what happened right around here is that the snowshoe hare either ate too much food and, there just wasn't enough to sustain such a large population. Or think about if you're a lynx trying to get some hares, the more there are, the easier they are to catch. I hope that makes sense to you, right? If you're out there trying to catch something to eat, the higher the population, the easier they are to catch. So eventually you get to a point where your population's, once you get so high, you're not going to get much higher because your predator is just going to be able to easily snatch you away. So again, between food and the predator interactions, whatever happened, you can see the population declined again. And then obviously, if the hare population is declining, then the thing that eats them, which is the lynx, its population declines. So again, this just happens. You can see it goes up and down, up and down, up and down throughout the years. And I like that your book included this because, in my opinion, this is kind of like a third population growth model. So it's not exponential like we see here. It's not logistic because if it was logistic, this number would have gone up and kind of just stayed right here, right? It's not either one of those. It's boom and bust. So it goes up and down, up and down, up and down. So any questions about this? All right. If you download this PowerPoint, you can click this. There's a little video, little animation you can see that shows population ecology in action. More specifically, it talks about, I think, the different population growth models. Anyway, now we are done with the second main bullet point. We're making good time here. Technically, we should be done with this chapter this week, but whatever. I don't think that's going to happen. Now we're going to talk about applications of population ecology. And to me, this is better because none of you are biology majors. As far as I know, none of you are any kind of science majors. So all of this so far has been academic to you. So you might be thinking, well, why does this matter to your average everyday citizen? And here we go. That's what we're going to talk about. And this is kind of the introduction to what we're about to talk about. Your book points out that natural ecosystems have been converted to those that produce goods and services for our benefits. So take, for example, you think about, I don't know, the Midwest, or not the Midwest, think about like places like Nebraska, Iowa, places like that. They had natural ecosystems. So it was probably this natural prairie land with certain species that certain species of grasses and all the different animals that supported those grass species supported. And then humans went in there and like, oh, this is nice, but what we need is food, right? So you used to have, again, this area that had all these different species of grasses and whatever else you might have. And then we said, no, let's just have this all be corn, right? So you remove it all and you plant corn. That is an example of turning a natural ecosystem into something that produces goods and services. In that case, it produces a good, all right, and the goods being corn, not services. So population ecology, which is what we're talking about this chapter, it is used to increase the populations of organisms we wish to harvest. And this example that I'm giving, that would be corn, right? How do we increase the population of corn? It is also used to decrease the population of pests. Obviously, if you're growing corn, you don't want things eating it, whether it be insects or birds. And finally, population ecology is used to save populations of organisms threatened with extinction. So these first bullet points make sense with the example I'm giving, right? If I'm talking about growing corn, that would be these first two bullet points. This third one's kind of alpha on its own. Save populations of organisms that are threatened with extinction. And I'm sure you've heard of, in your lifetime, species that have gone extinct. And more likely you've heard of species that are endangered, like tigers and certain elephants, giraffes, things like that. And we'll discuss that a little bit later because, again, this is just the introduction slide. But are there any questions so far? All right. You guys are nice and easy today. Hopefully you're awake and actually paying attention. Here we go. Now we're actually getting into it. We're going to talk about the applications of population ecology. What's the first one we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about the conservation of endangered species. And this is a very simple concept. You're probably already familiar with this. As growing up, you see, commercials and you read things and you hear things about endangered species. You're probably very familiar with this, with the general concept. But your book gives a great example of a conservation project. And you'll see why I call it a great example here in a second. But the example that your book gives, well, first of all, before I jump into it, hopefully, obviously, you understand it's in the name, right? Conservation of endangered species means, well, first of all, an endangered species is a species is close to going extinct, right? A species that will soon no longer exist. So what we're talking about here is doing things to protect a species like that. That's the easy part. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with that. Now I'm going to give you an example of a particular conservation project, and it is for the red-cockaded woodpecker. Now, as I go through this, you can give your note writing hand a break. I'm not going to ask you any specific questions about this, but I think this is a great example because it shows why knowledge is so important, right? So the easy thing to think of when you think, all right, we need to protect this woodpecker species. So the obvious easy answer would be something like, hey, you're not allowed to kill these woodpeckers, right? Now that's the easy thing, though. It's not like they had problems because they were being overhunted, right? That wasn't the issue. So that's not going to fix it. So then let's look at what could fix it. Your book gives some information about them. These things require longleaf pine forests. And if you're from the South or you've been there, that's where you'll see longleaf pine forests more often. Um, Now they drill nests in the holes of pine trees. So obviously, if they don't have the pine trees, then they don't have nests. Therefore, they're not going to survive. So there we go. Now we're starting to dabble into some ideas here of how to protect these woodpeckers. First of all, you might say we need to protect their habitat because the habitat is being lost to logging. Humans need wood. We need pine. Excuse me. Well, we do need pine, but we need lumber, right? So we're going to cut down trees. Humans just need lumber. Um, Agriculture. Again, if you had this big forest, I shouldn't say big forest. I don't know. If you had 200 acres of longleaf pine forest and you owned it and you wanted to grow corn, I'm just using that as an example again, then you would cut down those trees and turn that into a cornfield, right? So we're losing habitat to that. That part makes sense, right? Cutting down trees is obviously bad for a species, an endangered species that needs the trees to live. That's the easy part. Here's where it gets a little bit more complicated and why we need population ecologists, because we need people to study the species. Because again, it'd be very easy to say, all right, this is endangered. You can't hunt it, and try your best, and you can't cut down trees, basically, right? That part's easy. Here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. Another way that the woodpeckers were declining for loss of a suitable habitat is because we were suppressing fires that naturally occurred. Now, think about that for a second before I move forward. That is at first counterintuitive because I'm telling you that these woodpeckers have to have these trees to survive, and that cutting down the trees is bad for them because you're cutting down their habitat. So it might make sense to you to think, well, obviously we don't want fires because fires they burn trees. Therefore, we would destroy the habitat. Therefore, we would lose the woodpeckers. I hope that makes sense. Are there any questions so far of what I'm getting at? Okay. Moving forward. Let's talk about this whole idea of suppressing fires. Why is suppressing fires a bad thing for these woodpeckers? Well, this is why. When these birds are breeding, they have their nests they've drilled into the holes. This is where they've got their babies. This is where they've laid their eggs. If the vegetation around those trees gets too thick and it gets too high, specifically higher than about 15 feet, like somebody did the studies, they know how tall it needs to be or how tall it can't get the maximum height. The reason why they can't have vegetation higher than that is because they require a clear flight path between trees. So they need to be able to quickly go from this tree to that tree to this tree to that tree. Try to just imagine, a bird just bouncing around from tree to tree or flying around from tree to tree, right? And they need a clear flight path. Why clear? Well, you can't really fly through brush. That's a little bit hard. Well, that's basically the main reason. So the critical habitat was protected with a maintenance program that included controlled fires to reduce undergrowth. So again, let's go back up here. I'll remind you that this said suppressing fires that are natural occurrences. So yes, sometimes we might think, oh, fire is bad, and very often it is, especially these days when you watch the news and see the wildfires in California, things like that. But some fires are natural occurrences, and usually anything natural is good, at least for the environment. Usually there's obviously some exceptions to that rule. But what we did, or what, not we, what people did was they tried to go back to nature and said, since we have natural fires, why don't we let these fires occur? And they did. And what happened was those fires, they reduced that vegetation, right? So the trees still remain, but all that thick underbrush, it kills it off, right? So you no longer have this thick vegetation reaching higher than 15 feet. So now these breeding birds can have that clear flight path, and therefore they can keep their nests, and therefore they can keep reproducing, and the population rebounds. Excuse me. Are there any questions about that? All right. And again, I want to remind you, this is just an example. I'm not going to specifically ask you questions about this woodpecker situation. But the idea here is that, and I really think this is an important idea because this goes back to what I said on day one of this course. The idea of being a college educated citizen. and having this broad knowledge because sometimes things aren't as easy as they seem. Because with this woodpecker, the easiest thing might be, like I said, you're not allowed to kill them. You're not allowed to cut down the trees, right? That's common sense, and that would help a little bit. But also, what might be common sense would be, like, well, don't let the fires burn because that's going to kill their trees, and if it kills the trees, it's going to kill them. But that's actually wrong, right? So what we needed to do was let things burn. That was counterintuitive, and the only way we could come up with that is because there was somebody studying these birds. But anyway, moving forward. The next thing we're going to talk about, let's see, we got 5 minutes, sustainable resource management. We can knock this out. This is quick and easy. Sustainable resource management, it's kind of in the name. Actually, let me say this before we move forward. I would ask you, but I can't hear you. You need to understand what the word sustainable means. And if you've taken my Biology 108 course, you have, because essentially the whole course is based on this idea of sustainability. And what do I mean about sustainability? That just means you can keep doing something. So in this context, when we're talking about the environment, it could be food. Say, for example, you're on a cruise and a big storm hits, and you crash on an island, and now it's you and 1,000 other people living on that island. And let's also assume technology is very different, the world's very different, and you just assume that you're stuck there forever, right? Just you and those 1,000 people. No one's coming to get you. You can't get off the island. You're just in the middle of nowhere. Now, let's assume you had, I don't know, a certain amount of trees that produce fruit, um, and that's the only thing there is to eat. Now, obviously, to be sustainable, actually, now I'm going to use a different example. Let's say on that island there's a pond, and in that pond is fish that you can eat. And that's the only food you have to eat. I know that sounds weird because you're on an island. You're like, oh, just go fishing on the coast of the island. But for this example, just imagine that there's a pond with fish, and that's the only thing you can eat. There's nothing else. There's no other food. So sustainable would mean to feed those 1,000 people, like you would catch as many as you could because you want obviously as much food as you can because you need to survive. But also, if you say, for example, were to fish all the fish out of that pond, sure, you'd have a nice big meal that one night, but then you'd be dead, right? Because you just got rid of everything. So the idea of sustainability would be like you have to balance getting as many fish out as you want or as you need, also, but leaving as many as you can in there because that allows them to reproduce and allows you to keep it going, right? You can keep the idea there would be to figure out that sweet spot. How many fish can we pull out of that pond? Like the maximum number of fish we can pull out of that pond, but also have them reproduce enough to keep it going. And that's where we get to this. According to the logistic growth model, which we talked about earlier, remember that's the one that it's not J-shaped because that's the first one, that's exponential. It starts as J-shaped and then it evens off to zero at carrying capacity. So according to that model, the fastest growth in a population occurs when it is at 1/2 the carrying capacity. I wish I could draw it. And if I was on my other computer, I could. Just try to imagine that S curve, right? It goes like that. Try to imagine right there in the middle of the slope between the bottom part and the top part. That's the sweet spot. So whatever the carrying capacity is, you want to hit half that number. Um, Now that's a hard thing to do because first of all, you have to calculate the actual carrying capacity. As we talked about earlier, that's all theoretical. We don't actually know the exact carrying capacity usually. So you have to figure out what that is and then try to maintain or try to hit that sweet spot. I like that your book points out that logistic model assumes growth rate and carrying capacity are stable over time, but that's not trade. That's not true, right? Carrying capacity will change. As you get more resources, your carrying capacity would increase. As you get fewer increases, your carrying capacity would decrease. So even though you could try to figure this out, even though you might be able to hit that sweet spot, theoretically, which that in itself would be hard, it's always changing, right? That's not always going to stay the same. Your book gives an example of fish. Fish are still the only wild animal that are hunted at large scale. Now, you might think, well, no, we hunt deer and things like that. And we do, but not to the extent that we hit fish or hunt fish. And your book goes into specific details about the North Atlantic cod fishery. But with less than a minute left, I guess I won't get into that. So when we come back on Monday, we're going to finish going into this idea of sustainable resource management using this North cod fishery as an example. Though I've already given you a hypothetical example of a fishery, right? When we talked about that island in the pond that has fish in it, and that's the only thing to eat. That's a good hypothetical example, but when we come back, we'll use that real example. So that's 850. The last word for attendance is lotion. So that's it for that. What I'm going to do is X out of here, and then at 9 o'clock, I will log back on, on the other link for office hours. Does anybody have any questions before I stop recording and X out of here? All right. Well, don't forget to send me those emails for attendance. I do plan on making questions for this video. So you have to make sure to send me those emails before I post the questions, because after that, it's going to have to be the questions. Otherwise, I'll just assume that you're here, but you're not paying attention. So you guys have a good weekend, and I will see you either on office hours or Monday.